This is For the Love of Learning, Voices of the Alternative Education Movement. Be inspired by the voices of visionaries, changemakers, and ordinary, extraordinary people who do what they do, all for the love of learning.
This is For the Love of Learning, Voices of the Alternative Education Movement. I'm Lainey Liberty, and this is episode number 40. In this episode, we will explore math and some of the issues surrounding math education. Math. Why is a negative attitude towards mathematics common in our culture? Is it because math is indeed both difficult and demanding of the learner? Are lazy teachers, bad students, or the government to blame? Should educators emphasize on pedagogy and technology to make the learning simpler? Why is it important for students to work through basic math problems when we live in an era where one could turn to calculators or computer programs to do the mindless symbolic manipulations needed to get an answer? Is math even relevant anymore? In the U.S., most students will fail to achieve the mathematical skills necessary to pursue math-centric technical careers. According to STEM education statistics, in 2013, only 36% of high school students were even ready for college-level math. And the statistics further indicate that students of color and females score much lower across the board. There are certainly problems when it comes to math education. In tonight's episode, we will explore the reasons math education is failing and what can be done about it with an incredible and passionate panel. I'm anxious to get this conversation started, but first I'm going to give a brief introduction to each of our panelists. Although these introductions are brief, we have more information about each of our panelists on the show notes page located at consciousconsumernetwork.tv, and look for the show notes page for episode number 40. There you will find more extensive information about each of our panelists, backgrounds, and links to their projects and websites. So, first I'd like to introduce you to Susan. Susan earned her Bachelor's of Arts, Fine Arts, and Music with a minor in French. She also earned a Bachelor of Education. Early in her life, Susan became disenchanted with the North American education system and found that the creative talents and gifts we enter into the world with are often stifled. Susan's long career path with her abundant skills provided her with abundant skills. In the past, she has established a Montessori-style child enrichment program and worked with at-risk teens. After a career in film and television production, Susan found herself focused back on her original vision to create a meaningful education platform where children are nurtured to reach their fullest potential and blossom into joyful, creative citizens. In 2006, Peace School was founded. Peace Schools is so inspired by Susan's love of nature, our interconnection with all life forms, and knowledge that creativity and imagination are the backbone of education. Susan believes all of these things are essential for a meaningful learning experience. At Peace School, children live in wonder with the knowledge that there is a universe of limitless possibilities. So welcome, Susan.
Thank you, Lainey. I'm so honored to be here. This is wonderful and delightful, and that was a lovely introduction. Thank you. I just want to add to that Peace School was founded in 2010, but the intent for it was initiated in 2006, but the actual school was founded in 2010, and it was launched in 2013 in North Bay, Ontario in Canada. And we are now currently working on developing schools all over the globe. We've been invited into Belize, in Jamaica, in Africa, and India.
So next, I'd like to introduce you to Paul. Paul is the mathematics instructor for the early entrance students at the Transition School at the University of Washington and runs programming around the greater Seattle area with Math for Love. At Transition School, Paul's mission is to prepare students to excel as full-time university students in the field of their choice. But with Math for Love, Paul's mission is to provide genuine mathematical experiences to learners of a variety of ages. These mathematical experiences include elements of play, curiosity, and open-endedness, giving learners agency to ask and answer their own questions. These programs take place as before and after school clubs, weekend classes, library events, math nights, game nights, professional development, private parties, etc. Paul graduated from Northwestern University with departmental honors, earning a BA in mathematics in 2011. Since then, he has focused his further math learning on searching for ideas that are compelling, puzzling, accessible, and elegant to both young learners and PhDs. So welcome, Paul. We're so happy you are on tonight's panel.
I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me. I think this is my first ever podcast, so I'm excited to share my thoughts. But yeah, I think that was a really nice introduction. I think it kind of covered the key points. I come at K-12 teaching from a mathematician's perspective, so my interest is really in showing kids what mathematicians do and how mathematicians think.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you for being a part of tonight's show, and I can't wait to hear more. But finally, I'd like to introduce you to our third panelist, and our third panelist is Pam. Pam has been on the show before as well, and she is the mother of 3 grown-up unschooled girls. She is also an economics and statistics professor. Pam's family lives in Southern California, and she is on the board of the Homeschool Association of California. Pam and her husband pulled their eldest daughter out of 4th grade, their second eldest out of 1st grade, and never sent their youngest to school at all. And that was 20 years ago, and they became a family of unschoolers. All 3 of Pam's daughters are now grown and have careers after having excelled as college students, and each having received many academic honors and awards and scholarships. To Pam, unschooling means creating a peaceful, safe, and loving home with many opportunities for exploration, invention, investigation, and conservation. It means very involved parents who pay close attention to supporting their children's interests. And it means joy and closeness and a very special, very sweet parent-child relationship. So welcome, Pam. We're so excited you're here tonight as well.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here.
So why don't we start the conversation off? We've got such a variety of backgrounds from our panelists tonight. And I'd like to hear from each of our panelists a little bit more about your background and why you're passionate about being here tonight on a panel speaking about math. So Pam, why don't we start with you? And as I mentioned earlier, you were on the Unschoolers panel, and you actually, in that show, spoke very passionately about math. And so it was really important for us to include your perspective as the parent of an unschooler and a participant in the unschooling community. So the floor is yours.
So my background is in econometrics, which is the application of statistics to economic issues. And I've been teaching college level statistics and economics for over 30 something years. And so not only do I have a lot of kids who are not going to school or haven't gone to school that I interact with and talk about mathematics with, but also I've interacted with thousands of college students, mostly freshmen. And the one thing that I know when I look at those college freshmen, and that's been at private schools, state universities, and a lot at a community college, that they have severe math anxiety, and I would call it math phobia. They're terrified to take an economics or a statistics class. Their faces show it, their eyes show it, their hands clench, they get tense, they can barely speak. They are very, very anxious. especially if they think they might potentially be asked to do any kind of even really simple basic math in front of anybody. And having lived that for many years, I was determined not to do that to my own children. And so when my kids were in school and I started to see the development of some of that in early elementary school age, I pulled them out. They didn't, when they started college anyway, necessarily have all the sort of basic mathematical arithmetic knowledge skills. They hadn't memorized multiplication tables at 13 or so. One of my daughters had never learned what long division was. They were definitely what would have been considered quite behind by school standards, especially as they got up into the middle and high school years. Didn't seem to hurt them at all. So, my question about what's wrong with schools is kids are not really learning to do the kinds of skills that they're being taught. I have to reteach them in their college courses. They don't really know how to do basic arithmetic, divide a fraction by a fraction, or, they're confused by things like changing decimals to percentages, even though they've done it a million times throughout elementary and middle and high school. And they're afraid to do it. And the anxiety level is so high that they can hardly learn it, that it blocks their learning. So there's something wrong, something really terribly wrong with what's going on. I have a lot of ideas about what I think that might be. And I think it's hard to fix after the fact. Once kids are grown and they've become young adults, it's very difficult to go back and undo the damage that has been done to them so frequently very often back when they were 7 or 8 years old.
Paul, I'd love to hear a little bit more about your background as well, and what led you to, being a voice for change in the field of math.
So I started teaching when I was a university student. I was studying mathematics and started teaching chess. I was running before and after school chess clubs and working with like one-on-one chess students. And I was constantly asked, like, hey, I know you teach chess and I know you're studying math. Do you want to tutor my child? And my answer when I was first starting teaching was universally, no, I don't want to tutor math, because my perception of tutoring math was that I would be teaching people the same math that I learned in middle school and high school class, which I had no interest in teaching. And I think that part of the reason why I had no interest in teaching it is that it's so tied to these fears and anxieties that Pam kind of touches on. What transformed my thoughts on teaching math were some exposure to really interesting mathematical ideas that normally are reserved for university students. There's a lot of ideas that don't get touched on in elementary school or middle school or high school and are kind of a secret until you get to university. And what I started stumbling across towards the end of my university experience was that a lot of these ideas are totally accessible to elementary age kids and middle school kids. In particular, there's a video from a woman named Vi Hart about doodling in math class, and she has one in particular about doodling stars. And I watched this video on doodling stars, and I said to myself, that sounds really fun to do with kids. And I realized that these contexts that I had been running chess clubs, a lot of the things that I didn't like about the chess clubs, in particular the inherent competitive nature of a chess club, could be solved by, instead of trying to teach kids, I mean, with chess, you're teaching them chess, but you're kind of teaching them logic and problem solving as much as you are teaching them chess. And I could kind of continue teaching them logic and problem solving, but get rid of the competitive nature by substituting in these kind of genuine mathematical explorations. So Vi Hart has inspired me a lot, and there's a few other thinkers that I'm sure their names will pop up over the course of the next couple hours that I've essentially been just digging through what they've produced and looking for things that are challenging and interesting to me, that after looking at them for hours and hours, I'm still looking at them saying, that's still weird and that's still interesting and I'm still curious to look further. But simultaneously, they're accessible to these really young students, and they don't have a lot of technical machinery and technical kind of barriers to access.
Myself, my own experience with math was something very different from most. I think probably because I have a very creative background, and I'm just so connected with nature and things of that nature. When I got into school, math was very simple. When things were presented in math, I would see them, imagine them in my head, and I could apply them to whatever it was in life at that time. Whereas the math that was being taught, the way it was being taught, did not make any sense to me. And I was constantly battling with my math teachers. And to the point where when I was in grade 6, my oldest sister was in grade 12, and she was doing calculus, and she couldn't understand it at all. And so I helped her with it and showed her how to do it. And then when I was back in my math class, I had the principal of the school for my math teacher. And he was teaching something on algebra. I think it was algebra at the time. And he would put the questions on the board, and I would fire out the answers. And he said, well, how did you do that? And I said, well, it's very simple. I did this and this and this and this. And I know I explain it using somewhat of a calculus kind of formula in that sense. I would apply that to it. I would see how it worked, and I would see it visually, because I see how math is in everything. And so at the end of the class, he made me stay after class. And I got the strap. Those were the days when you got the strap. They had the leather strap, and I got strapped because I made a fool of him in front of the class. I embarrassed him. So it was always interesting. I mean, I always aced in math, but only because I could apply it to life. I could apply it to, because math is in everything. Math is everywhere. So when my children went through, they struggled with it as well. And the problem with math is that it's not taught properly. It's totally improper. The way it's being taught, it's taught out of context. There is no context to it. And there's a great article that I read when I was developing the curriculum for Peace School. I came across this article by Paul Lockhart called A Mathematician's Lament. And it was so powerful for me because it explained it so perfectly what is wrong with math, which is the teaching of math, the math curriculum. There's everything wrong with it, as Pam was saying. And that's why people are struggling with it. And if I can, I'd like to read just the first page of his article. Is that possible? I got time for this? Okay. So this is really poignant. And it starts out, a musician wakes from a terrible nightmare. In his dream, he finds himself in a society where music education has been made mandatory. In quotations, we are helping our students become more competitive in an increasingly sound-filled world. Educators, school systems, and the state are put in charge of this vital project. Studies are commissioned, committees are formed, and decisions are made, all without the advice or participation of a single working musician or composer. Since musicians are known to set down their ideas in the form of sheer music, these curious black dots and lines must constitute the language of music. It is imperative that students become fluent in this language if they are to attain any degree of musical competence. Indeed, it would be ludicrous to expect a child to sing a song or play an instrument without having a thorough grounding in music, notation, and theory. Playing and listening to music, let alone composing an original piece, are considered very advanced topics and are generally put off until college, and more often graduate school. As for the primary and secondary schools, their mission is to train students to use this language, to jiggle symbols around according to a fixed set of rules. Music class is where we take out one staff paper or our staff paper. Our teacher puts some notes on the board and we copy them or transpose them into a different key. We have to make sure to get the clefs and key signatures right. And our teacher is very picky about making sure we fill in our quarter notes completely. One time we had a chromatic scale problem and I did it right, but the teacher gave me no credit because I had the stems pointing the wrong way. In their wisdom, educators soon realized that even very young children can be given this kind of musical instruction. In fact, it is considered quite shameful if one's third grader hasn't completely memorized his circle of fifths. I'll have to get my son a music tutor. He simply won't apply himself to his music homework. He says it's boring. He just sits there staring out the window, humming tunes to himself and making up silly songs. In the higher grades, the pressure is really on. After all, the students must be prepared for the standardized tests and college admission exams. Students must take courses in scales and modes, meter, harmony, and counterpoint. It's a lot for them to learn, but later in college, when they finally get to hear all this stuff, they'll really appreciate all the work they did in high school. Of course, not many students actually go on to concentrate in music, so only a few will ever get to hear the sounds that the black dots represent. Nevertheless, it is important that every member of society be able to recognize a modulation or a fugal passage, regardless of the fact that they will never hear one. To tell you the truth, most students just aren't very good at music. They are bored in class, their skills are terrible, and their homework is barely legible. Most of them couldn't care less about how important music is in today's world. They just want to take the minimum number of music courses and be done with it. I guess there are just music people and non-music people. I had this one kid though, man, she was sensational. Her sheets were impeccable. Every note in the right place, perfect, calligraphy, sharps, flats, just beautiful. She's going to make one heck of a musician someday. Waking up in a cold sweat, the musician realizes gratefully that it was all just a crazy dream. Of course, he reassures himself, no society would ever reduce such a beautiful and meaningful art form to something so mindless and trivial. No culture could be so cruel to its children as to deprive them of such a natural, satisfying means of human expression. How absurd. Now, when you think of that, that is the comparison of how math is taught. Math is taught like a bunch of little notes on a page with no music, no understanding of the art of what math really is. So, I mean, I know that, Paul, you have some experience in this as well with your students. And Pam, you've spoken of this as well. So I'm going to let you take over.
I really like that essay as a starting point for this conversation. That essay is one of my favorite pieces of writing about math. And Lockhart actually has another piece that is a presentation of geometry and calculus called Measurement that I think is really, really powerful. But I'm just constantly struck every time I hear every little sentence in that, like all the little parallels between the way he talks about music and the way that he's obviously actually talking about math. I was laughing at the very end of that segment when he praises the student who's so exceptional, and the praise that he gives is essentially like he crosses his T's and dots his I's, and not actually about anything interesting or meaningful. There's nothing about ideas. It's just about, can you make the work look like what your teacher wants it to look like? And there's no space for play. There's no space for asking your own questions, for being curious. And those aspects of play and curiosity and having ownership over what you're looking at are so key to me when I think about what mathematicians do and what kids in school have no space to do whatsoever.
There are so many things in nature that are synonymous with math. All of creation has to do with math. Everything comes out of the nothingness. And I'll get into that a little later when I talk about Fibonacci. And but there's another mathematician, a very ancient mathematician, Pythagoras, who people feel is all about, Pythagorean's theorem and triangles and things of that nature. But Pythagoras was another really very interesting mathematician. He was also a musician. And many musicians are mathematicians and vice versa, because they go hand in hand. And when you can bring it together, it's phenomenal. Now, Pythagoras, he was also into astronomy and the theory of music. And he was one of those who founded music, and as we know it today, with the harmonics and the different tones. And how he came about it was, one day he was walking by a blacksmith shop, and he was listening to the anvil striking, the hammer striking on the anvil. And he noticed that as the blacksmith was striking the hammer on the anvil, it had different tones and different frequencies. So what he did was he explored that, and he started working with wires. He's the one who invented the stringed instruments. He was the inventor of stringed instruments. This was a mathematician, one of our great mathematicians, and he found that there was different frequencies, and all of these frequencies all had numbers. So you bring those numbers together. And he invented the guitar, the Pythagorean guitar, so to speak, was one of his inventions in a sense, but it wasn't the guitar at that time. But it is founded, the guitar is founded on the Pythagorean theorems of frequencies of the notes, but it has to do with all those combinations of ideas that are mathematical and how they come together. Pythagoras was an interesting character as well, because he was known to have traveled into other dimensions and hear the music of the spheres, and he would bring that back. And what people don't know about Pythagoras was, because of his mathematical genius and his understandings of mathematics and things like decimals and fractions, those were considered taboo by the church. And those who practiced this understanding of mathematics were actually put to death as a result, if they would not denounce the whole numbers. Whole numbers were all that were important at that time. So, I mean, there were struggles with math way back then, as well. It's been a struggle through history. But there are some who have managed the mathematician's mind, as Paul was talking, is phenomenal in how you see things. The mathematician's mind is very different from others, because they see the art and the love, the heart math.
There's a lot of other ways, a lot of big variety of ways to introduce math to children, and that don't necessarily look at all like math. And in a school setting, this is perhaps a little more tricky, but I'm normally talking to homeschoolers, and the first thing I ask them is always like, how do you support your kids in learning how to read? And there's always a lot of discussion about how they cuddle up and read to them. And I say, do you cuddle up and do math with them? And that always brings out laughter, as if that's silly. And the idea of like cuddling up and smiling and being warm and cozy and happy together and doing math seem like completely opposites to most families and most parents, until I give them my really long list of really wonderful mathematically related picture books that you could be reading with your 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10-year-olds. And it's a long list. And I recently did a session at a conference where we read them out loud, and they were really fun. And the parents were really surprised. And they all went around. I took maybe 40 or 50 of my math-related picture books with me, and they went around and took pictures of them so that they could go find them. And I wanted to say one other thing about that is that a lot of times there's not a lot of math going on in the home that's fun and loving and warm and, building relationships and good emotions and things. And that's because the parents themselves are suffering from math anxiety and they're avoiding it. And people often will say, oh, I don't really have math anxiety. I did okay. And yet I observe them and I watch that they're really avoiding it. And avoidance is a kind of anxiety as well. So when parents and teachers are avoiding the math, they're passing along that math anxiety to their kids or their students. Also, one other related thing, and that is that a lot of elementary school teachers, as many as from some studies have shown 30 or 40%, some have shown as many as 60 or 70% of elementary school teachers have enough degree of math anxiety that they get through the math as quickly as they can, and when a kid asks them a question that goes a little outside the normal expected way of solving a problem, the teacher's reaction is often a little bit fearful and a little quick to say, no, that's not how you do it, and shut them down in their exploring the idea of maybe solving it a little bit different way. And I think that's probably one of the ways that schools do harm in math, is that kids who are still alive and interested and curious when they get into a classroom can be really turned off by being constantly told that they're doing it wrong and not being encouraged to explore and stuff like that. So if you're in a classroom, using games and puzzles and stories and music and art and all the other things that might appeal to kids is a really great way to approach it. In a homeschooling environment, which is what I'm normally talking to, usually that just means doing the things the kids really want to do anyway, and just supporting that. You usually don't have to introduce anything new, as long as the parents themselves don't avoid it.
It's obvious to me right now that there's some discrepancies, not in what our panelists are saying, but really through my understanding of what is math. And that's really the most basic question at this point, because we're talking about math as puzzles, math as picture books, math as music. What is math? And I'm sure each of our panelists have a different perspective on that too. And actually, why don't we just jump right back over to Pam, because you're going to come at it from the perspective of a home-educated family versus more of a traditional education. So we'll start with you, and then we'll move through the panel.
So the question is, what is math, or what is wrong with math education? I don't know how to define what is math. It's everything. It's just everything. It's the whole world. Susan said that, and I agree. As far as what is wrong with math education, it typically involves a high degree of stress. There's usually testing. There's usually timed testing all the way back into very early elementary school, when they have to do sheets of maybe 30 or 40 or 50 addition problems in 60 seconds. And it's, they get a lot of big old red ink marks if they don't get them right. There's high stakes testing that involves math. There's an attitude that there's only one way to do things. There's an attitude that it's right or wrong. There's no questioning. There's no alternative. It's not creative. Kids often feel very embarrassed and ashamed, and they feel coerced. They feel graded, which has its that has its own negative effects. There's competition. There's a lot of mythology about math. For example, that you're either good at it or you're not. And if you're not, you might as well not even bother. That there are math brains and non-math brains. And my answer to that is always, well, there are music brains too. There are prodigies and geniuses. That doesn't mean we shouldn't sing or play an instrument and have fun with it and enjoy it. There's the idea that boys are way better at math than girls are, which is a complete fallacy. In many countries in the world, even with just regular standardized testing, girls outperform boys, although here they don't. And even in this country, boys are a little better on standardized testing, and they're also worse. They're just more variable. There's a mythology that it's really important to always get the right answer. There's the biggest probably belief that pervades our society is that, and the number one thing that kids learn in math is probably math is really expected to be hard, and you're probably not going to be very good at it. And if you're not really good at it, you're kind of dumb, and you should just kind of give up and think of yourself as not able, incapable of doing math.
I think this question of what is math is really interesting. I regularly show games or puzzles to students, and after playing around with it for 1 or 2 or 5 or 10 minutes, they'll come back and say, this isn't math. And I love hearing that comment because it gives the opportunity to have this conversation with the group of like, what is math? And almost universally, one student will say, math is about numbers. And someone will say something like, math is about plus and minus and times and divides. And that's one aspect of math, certainly. But giving a kind of more well-rounded definition of math, I find really, really difficult. What I often emphasize with students is if your thinking involves a lot of ifs and thens, you're probably doing math. If you're thinking along the lines of, well, if this happens, then that has to happen, so that means that this has to happen, then you're doing math in some sense. Lockhart, in this essay that Susan referenced earlier, suggests that math is an art, and the thing that's wrong with math education is that we don't teach it as an art. And in particular, I would go further to say that he argues that the thing that's wrong with education is that, or with math education, is that nobody has any idea what mathematics is. I think the kind of cop-out answer is mathematics is what mathematicians do. And if you ask people what mathematicians do, again, the answer is almost universally, I have no idea. Kids will say things like, they probably work with really big numbers. Like, I'm just learning 2-digit multiplication. Mathematicians must do like 20-digit multiplication. And that's obviously a rather naive answer. But it's difficult to really explain exactly what it is that mathematicians do. And it's especially difficult because almost no one in the K-12 world has ever actually practiced mathematics in a real sense. The people who are responsible for showing our kids what math is and teaching our kids how to do math themselves have no idea. They just heard from their teachers and their parents, and they heard from their teachers and their parents. And I think part of the problem with math education is that the mathematicians, the people who actually find this subject so elegant and compelling, kind of keep to themselves a little too much. So that's kind of why I have, for the time being anyways, opted out of pursuing a PhD, is that I don't necessarily want to participate in this insular, self-centered exploration of math. I want to take what I know about what mathematics is and try to show people.
Right on, 100%. I'm totally with you. And the one benefit of starting your own school and your own education system is that you have the freedom to present math in that kind of a context, give it a context, and provide a platform, a foundation for children where they can understand this whole creative aspect of what when I grew up going through school, we didn't have calculators. There weren't calculators till I finished school. So we had to use our heads. So the one thing I know that's important, because part of understanding mathematics is being able to stretch the mind, stretch the imagination, and we have to use the imagination. And when you're going into a calculator, it's like you're not exercising. It's like watching a movie about people exercising and thinking you're getting it. You're not. And without that stretching and learning how to use the imagination, you're stuck on one concept, and you think you can't do it. I can't do it. I can't do this, so I can't do anything else. You can't get past that hurdle, and you're stuck. So one thing that we teach in Peace School, I start off with Fibonacci, and not many people have heard of Fibonacci. I don't know if you have all heard of him. Fibonacci is an interesting mathematician from about 800 years ago. He had studied rabbits, and he's discovered about the Fibonacci sequence through his studies of rabbits. He started with the 0 point, which is the 0 point, which is the nothingness out of which everything from the imagination springs. And that's where creativity comes in. Oh, I should also mention that Fibonacci was the one who turned us from Roman numerals to the number systems that we use today to make things simpler, to simplify how we view math. He was responsible for that. People don't know that either. So here's another historic point. Anyway, he went on and discovered that in the multiplication of these rabbits and how they multiplied exponentially, it was like 0 plus 1 is 1, 1 plus 1 is 2, 2 plus 1 is 3, 3 plus 2, and you just keep going on and on. It goes on through infinity. And so then he went out and he started to discover that these mathematical symbols were in everything, in nature. And so what we did in the school was I would give them this history on this wonderful thing, because children love rabbits. They love to know that they've got an imagination and that they are all very special, and that everything that ever was possible is within them. They don't have to look outside. They can start from within, and then they can see it outside of themselves. And then I would show them a video, which we're going to be showing during the break, and then I would take them out for a hike through nature. So they would see how mathematics is in all of nature, and they would collect all of the different little pieces of things that they would see the structures, these mathematical structures in them. And you'll see some of them in that video. And then take those items back into the classroom. They would also pick up a very special stick. They would find themselves a very special stick and bring that with them. And then they would attach all of these special items to that stick. And in doing that, they would create themselves a talking stick. So this is part of the creative experience and using their imagination as well. And everything that we teach within the Peace School is given that same kind of exploratory context. They go out and they explore, put their hands on. If they're studying measurement, for example, we might go out and measure their desks, or measure the playground, or measure something, or create or build a construct. They might design something that they want to build, like a step stool. We had a GDD student who designed a step stool, a global deficit disorder. She had cerebral palsy, and she designed the step stool, and she measured it all out, built it, painted it, and had the step stool. The reason she did a step stool is because she wanted to be able to get into the fish tank. So there was a whole pattern of following a path that was of interest to the individual student. And each one is different. So each one will take their own path of discovery in finding out where that goes to and where that leads to.
I think this is a perfect time to take a break. Susan, since you mentioned the video, why don't we go to that video? But before we do, I just want to acknowledge this panel and say, this has been amazing. First hour already. I have learned so much. We've redefined what I thought math was. And this has really been a fascinating conversation. I'm looking forward to the second hour. So we'll be back in about 3.5, almost 4 minutes, and we'll continue the conversation.
Thank you.
one particular focus on math that perhaps, as Susan said, may not be as common as it's not as common as within the public school system. And I know, Paul, you had a response to the Fibonacci as part of being part of the foundation of math teaching within the school system. So the floor is yours.
So I really like the Fibonacci sequence. I find it really elegant and beautiful, and it's super compelling that it appears in so many different places and so many different contexts. What's interesting is that I very rarely actually end up talking about the Fibonacci sequence with students. And the reason, I think, is that the Fibonacci sequence is a situation of mathematics appearing in the sciences, appearing in the world. But what I find with the Fibonacci sequence is that there's not so many purely mathematical contexts in which it comes up. There are a lot of other sequences, like the triangle numbers in particular. The triangle numbers they go 1 and then 3 and then 6 and then 10, which is 1 and then 1 plus 2 and then 1 plus 2 plus 3 and then 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 and so on and so forth. And the triangle numbers somehow get glossed over all the time. They don't necessarily appear so much in nature, but if you're asking mathematical questions, I think that sequences like the triangle numbers come up like way more frequently. And the reason that I think I find myself enjoying that sequence more than the Fibonacci sequence is that it comes, rather than from looking externally, it comes from looking internally. It comes up a little bit more, it's interesting to say organically, I guess, because what I mean when I say organically is not that it comes from nature, but rather that it comes from the questions themselves. So I am always struck by how when people are trying to challenge the kind of traditional K-12 math education, the Fibonacci sequence is like such a prominent part of it, because I find that it's really difficult to play with. And although it is compelling and beautiful, it doesn't highlight the aspects of mathematics that I think are so critical, which is this ability to make it your own and play with it.
That's really fascinating, Paul. I actually want to ask this panel, what is the purpose of math competency? Is it to be good at math, or are there other reasons that cause us to pursue math? And we'll go back to you, Paul, and then I'll open it up to the rest of the panel.
I suppose it's interesting to try to ask what the purposes of math competency are when we haven't quite decided what math is. What does it mean to be math competent? To me, I think that the most important thing when it comes to being math competent is being able to problem solve, being able to analyze, and being able to communicate about mathematical matters. What is, I think, really terrifying to me is that you can come out of a top-notch, supposedly, math education, scoring top marks, getting an 800 on the SAT, getting like perfect score on like AP calculus tests, and if you're actually faced with any real question, you're like, I don't know. I've never seen this before. I don't know what to do. Can I write a quadratic? And there's just no ability to actually make meaning. So something that I find myself emphasizing a lot with my students is not just being able to get answers. I talk a lot about the difference between answer getting and being competent. And it's not about being able to get answers. It's about being able to communicate about what you're doing as you're doing it, before you do it, after you do it, when you get stuck. Like at all aspects of problem solving, you should be able to reflect clearly on what you're doing, why you're doing it, and where it's taking you.
In Lockhart's Lament, or the Mathematician's Lament, was the fact that it's taught in a way that it doesn't provide a context. It doesn't provide an application so that there's an understanding of what it is. that we're learning. It isn't applied to our life and our life skills. And I think if that was changed, it's all great to have a great memory. And all these competencies are about those who have the better memory and have a better way of memorizing things so that it makes sense to them. Mind you, there's always those who have the gifts of being a mathematician. Many of us are gifted with different things, and each one of us comes with different gifts in this world, and how we apply them is different, and how we understand what it is that we are learning and exploring in our world is different for each one. So these competencies and these tests, they're competitions. They're not based on the individual student, and each one of us excels in our own right and our genius in our own right, whereas all the testing within our education systems has thrown it into a different kind of arena where there is the struggle to try and be the best at this rather than to understand and have, as you said, meaning applied to what it is that you are being given and directed into. And it applies in all subject areas, but particularly mathematics has been given a hard shake because the music is not there. You're given all the notes and you're not given the music to play, to understand it, as Lockhart stated.
When I went to school, I believed that math equaled arithmetic. I thought the two were synonymous and there was nothing else to it. And I thought that arithmetic dictated that there were only absolute answers. But when I got through to high school and I started to learn some of the higher math, I suddenly was faced with concepts. And through a conversation that I was having with my son today, talking about the show tonight, I said to him, and these were my words, math was my gateway drug to conceptual art. So through math, through the stuff that I was rejecting, the arithmetic, which I hated, when I finally got into higher math and was able to start thinking abstractly, it opened me up to other things. And so when this panel's talking about what the reasons that we must pursue math, I totally agree. And I see that it's totally different for each person. So when I asked you how we define math, it's amazing that we had, 3 different answers here. But what I want to ask this panel next is, if math is arithmetic and computation is equal to math, don't we just have computers to figure that stuff out? So, let's see where this question leads this panel to next. And I could see, Pam, you're chomping at the bits to jump in. So why don't I hand the floor over to you?
Computers can't figure out what the problem is. This really goes back to Paul's statement about what kids need to learn and adults need to know is how to make meaning out of what they're learning. And, a computer can't make that meaning for you. You have to know what you're looking for. And, we don't have that kind of artificial intelligence or whatever it would take to, I don't know. I think computers are fun and they should be allowed to play on them as much as they want and do all kinds of different things. And when kids are playing video games and all those things, they're learning a lot of math. I'm kind of surprised how my students don't know how to measure things. I don't really understand why that is, but they don't know what an inch looks like. They can't hold up their hand, like that and say, this is about an inch. They have a lack of sort of comprehension of measurement units. And so I would say from the time they're little, have rulers and yardsticks and scales and, all, measuring cups and all kinds of things that they can measure things with just in their play. Just have those available. And this is one of the things that math-phobic parents and teachers don't do because they don't realize that they're avoiding having things around that might look like math. So they have all kinds of wonderful art supplies. And they have all kinds of beautifully written, literature for children, but they're avoiding having calculators laying around the house, just laying there, and rulers and things like that kids could use. The fraction blocks, pattern blocks, are like so much fun. Kids play with them. And so when my kids were growing up, we had pattern blocks, which are little blocks that have different shapes, like little hexagons and triangles and squares and things like that. And they're little wooden, probably plastic now, but little wooden colorful blocks. And we had probably about 1,000 of them in a big basket. And they sat in the living room and people played with them when they visited us. And they weren't limited to the children. But certainly they knew nobody ever had to teach them what a triangle was. That was the idea, that somebody has to memorize what a triangle is and be tested on it seems silly. They just played with triangles and they developed their understanding of the properties of triangles, and they wondered about them, and we had conversation. And I wanted to add, don't ever underestimate the value of good conversation. That's probably the number one way my kids and most of the homeschool kids I know that have done well in math have learned, is through conversations.
A lot of the children today are so locked up in their rooms with a computer, they're not engaging, they're not socializing, they're not really engaging their minds. And if you haven't, like some people have the ability to provide that kind of environment, that enlightened environment for their children already, but many don't. Many don't, that are a lot of these children. So if you're not providing something that shows them how they can engage in another way, in a real way, in a feeling way, and an emotional way, rather than just always having their head in a computer or a calculator. It's good to have them. They have their place, for sure. And it's good to learn how to use them, because there's many times I use a calculator as well, and especially when I'm doing my accounting. You need to have those kinds of skills, but it's all part of the skill sets that we need to develop. And math, there's so many different ways of learning it, and so many different ways we can engage in applying math in what we're doing. As you say, going in a grocery store, that was a great example. One way is when you're learning about measurement, you can bake a cake, show them how the measurements work, make a pizza, cut it up in fractions, show them how the fractions work, things of that. Everyday things, you're engaging it, but I think it's very important to apply what it is you're learning so it has some meaning, as you had mentioned in the beginning.
In terms of calculators, it seems like the difference between the way that you're referring to calculators is, Pam, you're talking mostly about calculators as a toy, as something to play with. And I think that, Susan, your kind of aversion to calculators is when kids are using them as a crutch. And I think that distinguishing between those two uses of calculators is really important. I do certainly think that there is very much value to doing computation without calculators, in particular in terms of developing an intuition for number sense, an ability to estimate. Doesn't really come very clearly from a calculator. In terms of math as just a conversation, as a way to kind of teach math in the grocery store or anywhere else, that comment really, really resonated with me. I think that the vast majority of my math education came in that form. I was going through school in a kind of normal K-12 sense, but the math in school was never how I was actually learning math. I was learning math in the car with my dad when he was estimating how long it was going to take to get to school based on the speedometer, and when the light turned red that he wasn't expecting to turn red, he was kind of adjusting his calculations. And as we were in the grocery store, and all these kinds of random contexts of like, okay, you have $5, like what can you get? I also want to kind of rewind back to Pam's comment on kids getting through school and having no notion that there's unsolved problems. That comment like immediately piqued up my interest, because I really, really like showing students these unsolved problems. And in particular, I want to just bring everyone's attention to a resource if you happen to have kids at K-12 that you are around sometimes. At mathpickle.com, there is a resource of unsolved problems. There's one unsolved problem for every grade level from kindergarten to 12th grade. So there's a problem that is totally accessible to kindergartners. They can play with, they can explore, they can try to figure out. So far, nobody's ever figured it out. But somehow that never stops a kindergartner from thinking that they're going to be the one to figure it out. And it never stops a first grader, and it never stops a second grader from being like, I could be the one to figure it out. At some point, I think that students get taught that no, if nobody else could do it, then you can't do it either. And I think that that's kind of sad, that these unsolved problems somehow become a little bit less of a, I think I could get this done thing as kids get older. And then I also wanted to make one more comment about playing with calculators. You mentioned this idea that if you multiply any number by 2, you get an even number. I want to suggest a slightly more perturbing thing that happens on calculators. If you look at the like doubling numbers, the powers of 2, you start at 1 and you double it and double it and double it and double it. You get 1, 2, 4, 8, and then 16, and then 32, and then 64. And what I noticed with a student who just randomly kind of commented on it, he was just writing out the powers of 2, and he said, Paul, look, the ones digits go 2, 4, 8, 6, 2, 4, 8, 6, 2, 4, 8, 6. And I said, oh, weird. What do you think that is? Like, what do you think that's about? And he said, I don't know, but it's always even numbers. And if you're just going to stop there, it's just, okay, I noticed something kind of interesting. But where I think the real mathematics starts is when you realize, well, I could do this not just with multiplying by 2 over and over again. I could say, what if I do the tripling numbers? What if I go 3, 9, 27, 81? So far it's 3, and then 9, and then 7, and then 1 in the ones digit. And then it repeats. 3, 9, 7, 1, 3, 9, 7, 1. And you get a whole series of questions to ask. What if you do this with 4s? What if you do this with 5s? What if you do it with 6s? What I found really interesting is that 5s and 6s don't cycle through anything. It goes 6 and then 36 and then 216 and then 1296. They just always end with 6. And 5s always end with 5s. But somehow there's weird patterns going on. When you do it by 8s, you get the reverse of what happens if you do it by 2s. And there's some just strangeness going on. These are not unsolved questions. These are questions that are well understood, but they're hard, like way hard. Like if you ask your teacher in school, they're going to say, I have no idea where to begin. They're questions that like you can play with as a 7-year-old. But if you want to answer them, you might need to get a PhD.
What is it that you think teachers really need to have as a prerequisite in order to successfully teach math? And I'll go back to you, Paul.
It's a hard question. Paul Lockhart argues that you can't teach teaching. He says that if you're not a teacher, you're not a teacher. And if it's not like just in you, then you can't really teach it. I've had no formal training with teaching. I never took any education classes. I've never like had a period of time where I was observing one teacher for 6 months or something like that. My teaching is really just sharing my passion. I am passionate and I'm curious. And when I see kids stumble on things, I can recognize like when they see something that they can take further and when they see something that can lead them to some insight that's meaningful for them. And I think with math, in order to have that sort of intuition, you really just have to be strong in math. Like you have to just be able to see when kids are on the verge of something. And maybe more so than being strong in math, you have to be willing to play and willing to take yourself into territory that you're not comfortable with. I'm like very regularly exploring topics with students that I have no idea where they're going. I have no idea what the answers are. I don't know if we're going to get to any answers. And that doesn't stop me at all. That like doesn't make me say, ooh, we should go into safer territory at all. I'm perfectly happy to see where we can get. And part of that is because I'm confident that at least I can keep up with my students. At least like I can if they want to take it in this direction, like, let's take it in this direction. But I don't know what kind of criteria would establish effective teaching. I think that's really difficult.
I have an idea. Give them a problem that's really actually not solvable and see how they handle it. And if they give up really quickly, they shouldn't be teaching.
From the perspective of the Peace School, we approach teaching from a different perspective as guides, not teachers. We're not teaching stuff down into the box. We're drawing information out, and we're helping them, guiding. We're mentoring. We're facilitating the students. So I went through the education, the Bachelor of Education program, and I can tell you that my math professor had his own math book that he was promoting, that he had written on how we were supposed to teach math. We didn't have any examples from anyone else. It was just his math that was being taught to the province. And so we had his book. And there were things in it that did not make sense to me from a perspective of one who understands certain things in math. But that's the way he had been taught. So he was presenting what he had been taught to the education teachers. So all of these people were being programmed and had to follow his book, or they would not pass the courses. And this is the kind of thing we find everywhere throughout the education system, is that we're learning from people who learn from somebody else, who learn from somebody else. So we've got this system that started out all wrong in the beginning, and it's just continuing on and on and on and on. I liked your idea, Pam, of suggesting there's a problem that they need to solve, something that is, every problem is solvable. But if someone can, in some ways, there is always a solution to every problem. But there are some that are more complex than others. So if you could give a really, really complex kind of question, some would have to come up with something very dynamic in their idea of what to solve. And I think that would be a really good idea as well, to find out whether you're one who is deemed for being a teacher or a mentor or a guide or a facilitator. From my heart, I believe that the whole math system, curriculum, needs to be changed. It needs to be transformed. It needs to be re-enchanted. It needs to have another element of art infused into it in a way that children find it fun. Education and learning should be fun, no matter what we're doing and whatever subject we're taking. And it should always have a context as it applies to our own lives, so that we can understand it and see the magic that is available in our lives in learning in any subject, be it math. You can take your math and you can apply it to history. You're talking about dates and things of that nature, and ages and all of those kinds of things. You can apply it to your sciences, of course. All the sciences require math. Everything requires math. Absolutely everything. And if you can just take that and add it to another subject area, then you might have a greater understanding of it. But I think the way it is sectioned off in this little broken piece of a puzzle, you haven't got all the other parts of the puzzle. You just get one part of the puzzle. And no wonder it's confusing. And no wonder children are bored, because they don't understand it. And because they don't understand it, they feel they lack confidence in themselves and they think they're stupid. And when you have that, then you just have a downward spiral. So we need to add something to the education system, change it, transform it in a way that's much more positive.
Pam and I are similar in the sense that we're both coming at this from the perspective of an unschooling family. I currently have a son who is a teenager, and I get questions all the time. You mean you're not demanding that he learns math, you're not forcing him to do math? And I always say no. What does he need it for? What does he need it for? He's getting logic and problem solving and all of these other things. through other experiences. And I believe in my heart of hearts that that's the purpose of math education. I want to take this question to the panel, actually. I'd like to know what you think the purpose of math education actually is. And that way, if we're looking to transform it, as Paul and Susan and Pam suggest, it'll give us a better idea of what the goals are. So who would like to respond to that question first?
I think it goes back to the ancient mathematicians. I think it all goes back to the ancient wisdom. We've become lost. There was a start and a beginning of exploration and wonder, where these amazing people like Galileo or Pythagoras or Fibonacci or any of those wonderful people who were interested in stretching beyond what was being presented to them in their world. They looked into the stars. They looked across the ocean. Look at Columbus, for example, or people who have Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, all of those great ones who had such ancient wisdom that dates back to times of Atlantis and Lemuria and those ages that were so much more advanced than we are here today. But we do see a lot of those traits within our society today. It seems like we're being reincarnated into this world that has a conglomerate mixture of different aspects of societies and ancient society. So if we can explore a little bit more about their methods of teaching, like a Socrates or a Plato, how they taught in their academies, and how they worked with groups of students to explore problems and explore ideas and explore concepts, much like you're doing with your son. You're exploring the world. And Pam, you with your children as well, having that opportunity to explore from another perspective, from a realistic perspective, something that is going to give you meaning. And I think wherever there's meaning, you will have a quest and a thirst for learning and for wonder about what it is that makes up the cosmos, what it is that makes up this world. Why are we here? And you can go back to those questions. And what is it that we are? And what is our purpose? You take it can go back to that. And then you can step out from there. And math, I think, is all very much a part of it. It's that coming from that point of imagination. And the wonderful ideas and the dances that can go on in your mind with music. Look at great musicians like a Mozart or a Beethoven or a Bach, and how they explored ideas and concepts. The music was given to them. Where does that magic come from? Where does that imagination come from? We've all got something coming from somewhere else. Let's explore within so we can bring it without.
You brought up some really, really incredible points. I'd love to jump back over to Paul. Paul, why don't you go ahead and share what you think the actual purpose of math education should be?
I think it's a really hard question. I think it's particularly difficult because mathematicians in general aren't really so focused on getting anything done. And somehow like our math education system is focused on actually creating maybe some sort of more well-rounded citizens and more effective people. Whereas the point of mathematics, as a point of the purpose of mathematics education, is much more useless. Like mathematics sure is to understand the world around us from a scientist's perspective. But from a mathematician's perspective, like mathematics is oftentimes just something to play with. So what's the purpose of math education? I have no idea. To prepare people to operate in a increasingly math-filled world, I guess, according to the very dark like analogy that Lockhart gives, to teach perseverance and problem solving, to teach people that when they are stuck with something hard, they can sit down and figure it out, that they can work through things, to teach people how to be precise about what they think they know and what they know, to teach people to be curious and to play. I think it's particularly difficult because mathematicians in general aren't really so focused on getting anything done. And somehow like our math education system is focused on actually creating maybe some sort of more well-rounded citizens and more effective people. Whereas the point of mathematics, as a point of the purpose of mathematics education, is much more useless. Like mathematics sure is to understand the world around us from a scientist's perspective. But from a mathematician's perspective, like mathematics is oftentimes just something to play with. So what's the purpose of math education? I have no idea. To prepare people to operate in a increasingly math-filled world, I guess, according to the very dark like analogy that Lockhart gives, to teach perseverance and problem solving, to teach people that when they are stuck with something hard, they can sit down and figure it out, that they can work through things, to teach people how to be precise about what they think they know and what they know, to teach people to be curious and to play. I don't know. There's a lot of purposes of math education. Number sense also, that's important.
I think there's a lot more to it than that. And I
bet.
think how to create, how to manifest, how to build our world, how to build a better world, how to solve problems, as you say. I mean, mankind has made a mess of this world as we see it as it is now, with a lot of the things that they've created. So we need mathematicians to come in and try and fix some of those problems. How to fly a plane, how to build a plane, how to build a car, how to build transportation, how to create a wheel. I mean, there's so many things that are all founded on mathematics. And if you didn't have the mathematics, you could never do it. How does a beehive work? Can we make a design that works and functions as well as a beehive with those hexagonal things? How is it that nature, how do things work in nature? How can we build out of that? How can we connect with nature? We need mathematics for that. How can we write music? We need mathematics for that. It's all mathematical. You need to do your 3/4 time, your rhythms, your beats. It has to do with your bar lines. You would never have a symphony if you didn't have mathematics. If you didn't have it all, you wouldn't have a symphony that was sounding together, functioning in a way that was musical, that was appealing to the ear. There's so many things that everything that we have is founded on numbers, the 0 to the 1, and then beyond. It's all founded on the number system. And once you start to explore it, you can see that there's so much magic in it and so much art in it. It just takes a passion and an understanding of that, and not a fear that has been created in the math schools, in the curriculum. There's a fear of math. Children are afraid of it. They're bored with it as well because they don't understand it, and they don't understand what it applies to and what they can do with it. How they can have a monetary system and that has some value, that shows that they have some value in the world, and how they can calculate that. What's your value? How do you make a pair of glasses? How do you make prescription glasses? The equipment or the machines that will help you to see better. All of those things, everything. Dentists, it's all mathematics. Fix your teeth. So a great smile. It's mathematics when you do cosmetics and you make cosmetics. It's mathematics when you do a design so it fits, and measurements and all those things so you can wear clothes. It's mathematics for your shoes that you wear. It's mathematics to build this computer. It's all founded on math, ones and zeros and whatever else comes out of there. but all of it comes and stems from math.
You give us a lot to think about. And Pam, I'm absolutely curious to hear what you're going to add to this conversation.
My comment earlier was we shouldn't do it in schools. So I think that that the purpose of math education has been subverted in some way, warped into some way that I disapprove of tremendously, because I actually think we should just throw it out. Obviously, that's not realistic and that's not going to happen. So my comment's a little flippant. I could do that with my own kids. They didn't do math. We just didn't do it. And they've got 2 mathematicians as parents. And we just said, no, we won't do it as a subject. We didn't have that in our house. But of course, that's also a little flippant, because they do math all the time, and all those things Susan talked about. Everything you do, every move you make in life almost involves mathematics. And so, there's no way to really actually throw it out. In a school, one of the things that I think is the purpose of math, for each grade level, the purpose of that grade level is to get you ready for the next grade level. And I think that's almost as far as the thinking goes. Some committee at some state or province or national level designed a curriculum, usually a committee composed of math educators, many of whom, as Paul said, don't have backgrounds in mathematics. And by the way, I did go through a secondary credential program in math. So I did have all that math, how to teach math classes. It was ridiculously bad. It was hours and hours spent on whether or not they should be allowed to use calculators in class. It was terrible. But the purpose of math, if you look at what is, as opposed to what we wish it would be, what Susan, all that stuff that Susan listed is all the things that it should be. And we probably all wish it could be. But what it appears to be is to get you ready for the next level. And then at the highest levels, in K through 12, algebra, the excuse for every kid being required to take algebra, which is how it is in my state now anyway, is every kid, in order to pass high school, has to have an algebra class, a high school algebra class. The excuse that is given is that it teaches logical thinking. It makes me just want to scream when I hear that, as if nothing else in the world it requires logical thinking except algebra, and as if that's the only way to learn it. Is it a way to learn it? Yes. Is it the only way to learn it? No. And in fact, when Paul mentioned anything that involves if-then, the first thing that came to my mind was video games. And, there's a way to learn logical thinking. Of course, I think economics is full of nothing but logical thinking. I think statistics is, but I also think so is psychology, and so is almost everything else. So is analyzing a play, so is, almost everything that kids do. Skateboarding, playing games, it's all full of logical thinking. And that can be learned through conversation, experience, all kinds of things. So I think it's a poor excuse for requiring every kid in the whole, school to learn to take algebra, and especially when it's taught so badly that most of the kids who take an algebra class most adults who report having high degrees of math phobia and math anxiety, that's where it happened to them.
I want to leave this on a high note. We've already discussed that math, that people have a fear of math, whether they go to school or even within the homeschooling community. There is this fear of math that we've either learned from somewhere or we've developed. And I'd like to ask each of our panelists what you suggest we can do if we're working with students or our own children or others in the community to help them and facilitate them to overcome these fears of math. And just quick suggestions, and then we'll go ahead and share our closing remarks after all of that. So Paul, what kind of suggestion would you have to put a positive spin on this if you came across a student who really had a tremendous fear for math?
I would say there's a handful of things. For one thing, I think it was Pam already touched on the use of timed tests, and in general, tests that emphasize rightness versus wrongness aren't particularly productive for, I think, either furthering education and certainly not for fighting that anxiety. I think that open-ended questions that ask students to speak and have conversation and take ownership over their ideas are really effective. And asking students to pose their own questions and kind of test their own limits of their understanding. Like, say, after they learn exponents, like just kind of checking in about, well, what if the exponents get weirder? Like, where are the limits? And like, if you play around with this, like, what do you understand and what do you not understand, rather than do this, do that. You don't know how to do this? Oh, that's a problem. Now do this. Just getting them to kind of self-assess more and reflect more and take more ownership and have more agency over their own learning.
Great. I do think it's very important that there is a foundation laid, that the children at least learn how to count. To start with, I think it's very essential that they learn about numbers and what numbers are and how they apply. And I keep going back to P school, and we were teaching kindergarten through 6. And we teach them all together at the same time and offer them these ideas, these grandiose ideas, but they take it from their own level of understanding, and they approach it from their own level of understanding with their own learning style and understanding. I think it's important I would agree, get rid of the math system as it stands now, but I think it could be replaced in a sense with, as it's brought into other subjects and applied within other subjects. So I think that that could be a better way of approaching it. I think all of those concepts of math are important, but each of them needs to be taught with a context and not left for later on or early on. It has nothing to do with age. Learning math has absolutely nothing to do with age. It has all to do with the a progressive development of each one at their own rate. And I think that instead of boxing children into grades by age, grades by numbers, I think it's more important just to enable each child to have the opportunity to express themselves at their own level without competition and explore those areas that they want to explore from their own perspective with guidance along the way. You offer them things, and then they take that. You offer a smorgasbord of ideas, and you let them explore them in the direction they wish to go. Mathematics, as I said, it's important to have the foundations there, but they can learn them in their own way. Apply them for making a cake, measurements. Apply them when they're planting a garden. How many seeds do you need to put in the row? That kind of thing. But do it in a way that they're applying it in their life as they're moving along.
Would like to remind our audience that all of our panelists' bios and links and information can be found on the show notes page at consciousconsumernetwork.tv, and be sure to look for show notes for episode number 40. So Pam, why don't we just go back to you really fast, and if you can give us your website and any projects you're working on, and we'll take it from there.
I have a little sort of website blog that's got a few things on it that I've written and some fun games and things like that. And it's called learninghappens.wordpress.com. So the Math for Love website is mathforlove.com. And then at the University of Washington, I work at the Robinson Center. So I think it's robinsоncenter.edu.
I have a school. It's an international school. It's a registered charitable organization, which is called Paradigm Education Academy of Creative Enlightenment, and for short, AKA Peace School. And the website is Peace, PEACE -school, SCHOOL.org. And I can be reached by email at info@peace-school.org. Thank you.
Awesome. Amazing projects, everybody. I'm so excited to have been able to share this evening with you and learn so much from each one of you. I just wanted to share with you really quick, there's an interesting fact that I discovered about where we are, and that is we're here in Mexico, and apparently the Mayans invented the number 0 800 years before they did in Europe. So there you go, a bit of trivia. So as always, thank you to our wonderful panel. Thank you to Mel and Biggie over at the Conscious Consumer Network. We are so grateful for you providing this platform that we can have these conversations week after week. We are so grateful to be here as part of your programming, and we believe it's a real great honor to be able to share these ideas. And thank you so much. Also, as always, want to thank Nina. Nina, you do an incredible job putting together these panels, and you have the wonderful foresight to imagine these dynamic conversations. So finally, wherever you are, whatever you do, continue to always do it for the love of learning.
The pursuit of a free, fair, just, sustainable world should be the focus of every person on our planet. The reason it is not is because people are kept distracted by the illusions and deceit propagated by the corporately controlled mainstream media. In recent years, the rise in truly informed, savvy researchers and journalists who have all taken to the air in various capacities has given rise to a new genre of media. We have seen the explosion of truly free and independent media, and thus the need to create an ethical live broadcast network that facilitated these brave and tireless souls became apparent. With a great amount of research and meticulous planning, Conscious Consumer Network was created. CCN is a first-of-its-kind broadcast network that is specifically dedicated to free and independent media with absolutely no government control, corporate sponsorship, or advertising. The live broadcast network runs full-time with an average of 25 shows and live broadcasts a week. The high-definition live stream is free to view and is accessible from any computer terminal with online access, including laptops, tablets, smartphones, and smart TVs. All shows are archived onto YouTube and are freely available to view in order to educate and inform as many as we can without imposing monetary limitations. CCN was successfully launched on the 1st of January 2015 and has gone from strength to strength as we have improved and increased the capacities and functionalities of the network, as well as an ever-rotating and improving lineup of content which is broadcast daily. CCN is blessed to be the home of some of the hardest-hitting, most cutting-edge, truly educational and informative materials. Catch interviews, reviews, and talk shows from the many different and beautiful perspectives from CCN's family of interviewers and broadcasters. Since the 1st of January 2015, we have produced over 800 shows. We have over 2 million YouTube minutes watched every month, and we have an average of 1 million hits a day on CCN's website. CCN is viewed in over 147 different countries and hosts broadcasters from 5 different continents. The time has now come to generate funding to keep CCN on the air for the duration of 2016. The total sum needed to continue broadcasting for 2016 is $60,000. This budget includes the replacement of computer equipment, the acquisition of secure servers, which are most needed as we keep getting hacked, plus the renewal of the broadcast license fee for 2016. This is a fraction of the annual budget used by mainstream media networks producing a similar quantity of content. This is what makes CCN so successful, unique, and accessible, is the ability to run a project of this size and reach on such minimal resources. CCN does not claim ownership over any of the material we produce and broadcast, as we firmly believe that information is the common heritage of all beings, and thus CCN belongs to you, the public, and it is up to you all to keep CCN going. CCN would like to thank those who have contributed to the network in the past with resources, content, information, time, and energy. We thank you for supporting free and independent media.